All right, folks, how we doing? All right, that's it. That's it. This side of the room, what the hell are y'all asleep? Howdy. I'm Roland Martin, of course, senior analyst for the Tom Joyner Morning Show, the host and managing editor of TV1's on TV1, and also a Texas A&M class of 1991. So glad to see all of you here. We are, of course, we're at South by Southwest, and clearly these two didn't get the email with these damn ties. Left mine in the room. I saw the people walking with jeans and T-shirts. I said, I'm really way overdressed for this joint. But we're glad to see all of you here. We're going to be talking about, of course, rebuilding this state in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. And so we were supposed to have a conference call. I said no. Then they said, what are we talking about? I'm like, haven't decided. So any notes, if you have any preconceived notions of what we're going to discuss, throw them out the window because that's not going to happen. So the whole point is to have a really free-flowing conversation for you to learn and to also understand what is happening in this state in terms of rebuilding after the devastation of Hurricane Harvey. So let's get right to it. And versus the introduction, I'll start first. In the striped tie, tell them who you are.
John Sharp, Chancellor of Texas A&M.
And you're doing what when it comes to Harvey? Just hanging around?
Hanging around. I'm head of the Commission to Rebuild Texas.
Geanie Morrison, State Representative, District 30.
John Whitmire, State Senator from Houston.
So I'm going to start this way. When it came to Hurricane Harvey and the whole rebuilding process, how did you study the other efforts after Katrina, after Hurricane Andrew, to see what they did right and did wrong? Did you go through that process?
Well, the first thing, well, let me just give you the evolution of the thing. This whole rebuild thing is in two parts. It's housing, both temporary and permanent housing, is in the General Land Office with Commissioner Bush, and everything else is with the Commission to Rebuild Texas. And of course, we had never been through that before. I think that the reason that the governor picked us is because in Texas you probably have, and I think it's generally acknowledged, that you have the best rescue operation that exists anywhere in the United States. You have three organizations, Task Force 1, Task Force 2, and Texas A&M Forest Service. And those, in any disaster that happens in the United States, are under the jurisdiction of FEMA, and FEMA can call them up, and the governor can call them up for anything. Those folks are very well trained. They're training today somewhere. They have volunteer fire departments, they have regular firemen under their jurisdiction during disasters. And so by the time a disaster hits, not only are they well trained, they've been training for 52 weeks to make sure the response is good, the recovery is good, but they also are in place before the hurricane ever hits, with boats, with all kinds of stuff. And so they rescued probably, I think the correct number is about 17,000 people in imminent danger of losing their lives, and they're well trained to do it. On response, it's a different story in Texas. The response being rebuilding, making sure the debris is picked up, and all these kinds of things. Because what happens is you may have a judge that went through Rita and a different judge for Harvey. And that county judge for Harvey doesn't know anything about it. So he doesn't know how to fill out FEMA paperwork. He doesn't know all this kind of stuff. And so one of the things most certainly that we'll recommend to the legislature later this year is that we do the same thing, that we make sure there's somebody in every single county in Texas, whether it's tornadoes or anything like that, that is fully up to speed on how to respond with the federal government on disasters, how to be there, how to know exactly what's happened the day that the disaster hits or the day before, what not to do and what to do and stuff like that. And I think that becomes real important.
Again, how vital is it to understand what other disasters we've had in this country and learning from them and what they did right and did wrong. You still have folks who are saying 20 plus years after Hurricane Andrew, they still are trying to rebuild and recover. And that was 1992.
Right. One of the, if I can, the first thing that we did when Governor Abbott appointed us to this is we went, we had several people from New Orleans, the people that were in charge of Katrina, the people that were in charge of Sandy recovery and things like that, that all came to our office and we brainstormed with them about their problems. Most of those problems had to do with waiting on the feds or waiting for some response and things like that. And so everything that they said don't do or do, we took that into consideration before we ever started the process.
Well, and as Chancellor Sharp said, you know, one of the issues is that where it came through, I'm from District 30, which includes Aransas County, which is Rockport, where it came straight through, Refugio, then up to Calhoun County and Victoria, have the 6 counties in that area. And when it came through, there had not been a huge storm like that in Victoria since '61, in Rockport since the early '70s. So just as the Chancellor said, there was no one there that had been through that was working to have a plan. And yes, people have disaster plans, recovery plans, but some of them were a little dusty and needed some work on exactly how to proceed. And especially the smaller communities, such as Rockport and Refugio and Fulton, they have very few government officials. They didn't have any service. They couldn't communicate. And so it's a little different than Senator Whitmire with Houston, who has a larger government to deal with something. And so it was kind of like starting over with a playbook. And I think we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot that we need to do. We need to be more prepared. The Chancellor has talked about having legislation that makes sure that the elected officials are more prepared and have training as far as all disasters, not just hurricane. You know, and the other thing is June 1st, hurricane season starts again. And so hopefully we're better prepared by what we went through, but we're still working on it. There's still a lot to be done.
Senator, unlike the other hurricanes that impacted multiple states, in this one, you're really dealing with one state, and so you're dealing with what's happening in the state of Texas. How do you ensure, when you talk about large counties and smaller counties, and then you're talking about cities within those counties, where people understand that we're all in this together, as opposed to we're going to get more than what you get, and understand in terms of how folks have to work together?
Well, it starts with leadership, and you have to have the state leadership recognize the diversity. I mean, Rockport is devastated. They need resources that perhaps Houston doesn't need. But Houston, having a major press and a strong former mayor, Sylvester Turner, raised serious issues, and he got a response. The governor came down with $50 million. Immediately, the smaller communities, Port Arthur, Beaumont, Rockport, and others, Victoria. What about us? Houston actually has deeper pockets than us in many instances, so he had to revisit that. I don't think the Harvey recovery, I don't think there's a model to look to. The size and scope of it is so vast. I mean, just if you want to drill down on the fact that in this instance, the government, flooded most of our residents themselves. I don't think people had any idea about the reservoir issue. In fact, we know. In fact, there's plenty of lawsuits taking place now. I mean, people were so homes. I wasn't familiar with the term "in the pond." Hell, that's the areas that the developers, the engineers actually knew was going to be the pond under the right circumstances. So there's not an explanation for that to the public, and I think we've got to address that. I think people are frustrated, and one of the real challenges is going to be for all of us is to address our colleagues who campaign on less government. You know, that's the theme for the last, since the new regime has taken over.
Well,
you can't recover with less government. What you want is good government. You want responsive government. And there's nothing wrong with asking for more money to pay for services and resources. You know, Houston was not prepared because we have a revenue cap brought on by those that think less government. When the state's growing probably about 1,500 people today. You can't provide rescue and recovery for more and more people. At the same time, you're reducing revenue. It clashes, and we see it every time we turn the corner. Houston didn't want to pay their firefighters overtime. Alceveda, being proactive, brought in his police force on Friday around the clock, stay at the stations. We've got emails coming from the city administration on Sunday night to the firemen, don't come unless you're called. Well, it was too late to call them once the streets were all flooded. So we got a hell of a lot of things we can improve on, and one is being willing to pay for services ahead of the time that you need them.
Well, one thing, as somebody who's covered politics for a long time, less government means not my backyard. But then when your backyard is flooded, Lord, where's the government? Where are people?
You're absolutely right. But let me also point out the thing about Harvey is it was an equal opportunity disaster. Unfortunately, it's not just Greens Point, which has been flooded, or the Meyerland area. It's across Houston and certainly some upward income communities of West Houston, the energy corridor, which is probably why it's getting more of a response than if it was just a low-income minority community of Greens Point.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that answers an example of something that answers the question you asked a while ago is what do we learn from some others? In Katrina, they paid about $70-something million, hired a consulting firm to sort of hold the hands, if you will, of the parish sheriffs and the folks like that, solve their problems and things like that. And there was some pretty serious criticism over paying somebody $72 million to do that. So what we did is we basically used the functions of the Texas A&M system. In other words, we have at AgriLife Extension that Dean Stover is head of, has 252 offices around the state in every single county. And so we assigned all of those folks in all 41 of these counties, your job, aside from what you have to do every day anyway, is to be there with every mayor and every county judge, because in Texas, the mayors and the county judges call all the shots. If you don't want a C-130 spraying mosquitoes, we have to route that C-130 around your county. And so those folks are still every day in contact with every one of those judges and every one of those mayors. And if they have problems with mosquitoes, if they have problems with debris, if they have problems with landfill rules and things like that, which Governor Abbott has suspended every rule we've asked him to suspend, at least temporarily, those folks send that back up to College Station, and the folks in College Station will contact the appropriate agency and get it done for them.
So the benefit that you have is you have infrastructure already in place that you can tap into that can also sort of change and impact those communities. I want to go back to the point that Senator was just making, because the reality is in these situations, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, it don't matter. When you flooded and you lost your house, you're all in the same boat. And so do talk about how that has forced political folks who are on opposite sides of the aisle to realize that when you're flooded, you're flooded. Doesn't matter if you're D or an R.
Right, absolutely. It doesn't matter. And, you know, the issues are we still have a lot that needs to be done. I mean, there's a long road still for not only for Houston, but for Rockport, Refugio, Victoria. There's still a lot of people that don't have a place to live. And we're going to have to resolve that during the session, because there are a lot of things that we need. And it's going to take more funds, and it's going to be something that we have to address for sure. But there are just so many issues, and I don't think we even know yet what all the issues are going to be.
When we say scale, so for folks who don't know, so how large are we talking about in terms of people, in terms of land size, in terms of potential dollars?
Potential of debris. Have you ever seen Kyle Field? You could fill it 72 times with the amount of junk that was left on the ground that had to be picked up in short order.
72.
72 times to the lights. That's how much debris was on the ground that had to be picked up, starting with where it hit at Rockport.
And debris is a terrible experience, but I'd like to get it to the human aspect. Today, we're told 9,000 families are still out of their house. 9,000 families, you know, 3 members to a family. We got around 30,000 Texans that we've identified that are not in their housing. Then we got thousands that have been relocated. We don't know where they are. We got 100 HISD bus drivers that have never shown back up after the flood. So if you have children in HISD and you're depending on HISD to transport them several miles to their school, you're not going to get picked up that day. They're turned into private carriers. And it's just these little drilling down on the human suffering that is not being discussed by the leadership nor the press to the extent. The debris, John, horrible. The first thing you had to do to give people hope is get the debris out of their front yard. I understand that, and we did a good job. TxDOT came in under John's leadership and did a major impact. But it's the human element that is still frustrating. And, you know, if you're in the West Houston Energy Corridor and you have your second home, you go to your lake house, your farm, or you got insurance, or perhaps flood insurance, but I've got thousands of Texans, particularly in the Golden Triangle of Beaumont. You talk to the county judge around Port Arthur, they've lost complete subdivisions. We don't know where they are. Rockport doesn't have a school district.
In fact, my wife was doing some work with rebuilding a lot of those churches in Port Arthur and Beaumont. And in fact, when I was on vacation in Hawaii, we were in the restaurant, and this woman said, "Oh, y'all from Texas?" She said, "Yeah." She said she and her husband had just closed on their home and moved in 3 days before Hurricane Harvey hit.
Okay,
and
my frustration.
They literally moved back to Hawaii, and it's probably one of the folks no one even knows about. And so, how are you surveying folks to know where people went?
Well, I tell you what.
Come back.
Well, there's about.
I'll come back to you on that.
No, I'm going to tell you.
Go ahead.
Well, this less government is catching up with us. We had one of the biggest disasters in the state's history, surpassed anything. Why wouldn't you consider calling a special session? Why were we having committee meetings in Houston instead of on the Senate floor or in finance to talk about? Why didn't we think about a special session? We got $11 billion. You're talking about some emergency funding to get people out of temporary housing? So I just would like to emphasize as we grade our papers is how do we do it different next time? And I think you have to have someone in charge, whether it be a fine institution like A&M or another entity, the accountability's got to start and stop there. It can't be a part-time legislature depending on county judges with the difference in Harris County and smaller rural county. Because local control governs, but maybe the local control model doesn't work when you have a disaster. Maybe it needs to come out of Austin.
Mm-hmm. Chancellor?
There's a couple of points on that. Legislature is spending money right now. For instance, if kids had left Rockport or left the school district, Rockport School District is being made whole. In other words, they're being funded on an ADA basis, average daily attendance basis, as if the kid were still there. And if that kid is in a San Antonio school, that San Antonio school is also getting paid. And so there's $1.5 billion probably will be spent, making those kids whole. The one thing that we have to, because the federal government rules are so quirky, one thing you have to be careful of, you don't want to spend your money too soon, because if you do, then the federal government says, you took care of it, you don't need it, and we're not going to get your money. And so during the process, while we're in D.C. trying to get money out of the federal government, which turned out better than I thought it would, you don't need to solve the problems that the federal government ought to be solving. But that doesn't mean that you can't take money from different agencies, which they have, in order to help. For instance, TxDOT. TxDOT had 72 crews, first time they've ever done it, from one end of the state to the other in that hurricane zone, picking up trash and things like that in counties and stuff like that. The other point to remember, too, is these counties are real different. Houston is a whole different breed of cat. Houston has a disaster recovery center that looks like the Department of Defense. I mean, they got their stuff together. And they didn't need a whole lot of advice about how to deal with FEMA, how to deal with folks like that, because they have professionals and can afford it to do it.
At mass and capacity.
That's a real different story in Refugio, and that's a different story in Victoria and Rockport and things like that. And that's the places that we had to send in our people. We ran them through hurried up courses, with FEMA on filling out paperwork. The worst thing that you can do, the biggest disaster, and we're seeing it from Ike and some of these other hurricanes, is that somebody said, okay, I got $30 million from the federal government to do X, and you forgot to document it. And you forgot to keep the invoices and stuff like that. And what happens is they come back with auditors 5 years after the disaster occurs and audit your books. And if you can't show them that $30 million and how it was spent, they claw it back out of your property tax revenues, which is happening in some of the counties down in Southeast Texas from reading them. And so that's the reason that we have to have people in every one of those counties that know this stuff backwards and forwards and train them just like we do in the rescue operation.
I want to throw out hard choices, because when you talk about rebuilding, you have to make some difficult choices. A lot of people say, no, rebuild what we had. But then, as your point, when you have homes that are in flood zones, when you have businesses, when you have you have those sort of examples, sometimes you have to say, we can't spend those resources. For each one of you, give an example where you've had to deal with that, had to confront a hard choice. Do we rebuild something that was really in a bad part of town, or where they could be flooded or impacted again?
Well, in Victoria, for example, we have the river that runs through too, and so that has been an issue. There is an area that has flooded numerous times. The city has gone in and bought some of those homes out. But the other issue, some people will not sell. And so they're really going to do another concentrated effort, because when the flood comes up and it's, 100-year flood or whatever from the river, and it floods them again, the other thing is people need to realize if they get money from FEMA and rebuild and then it happens again, do they get money again? And so, you have to look at, like you said, where you're getting it, where you're not. One of the biggest issues is housing, and all the people that did not own a home, that were renting, they don't get anything. I mean, basically, they get a little substance help. And so we still have a lot of people that don't have a place to live. A lot of people still living in hotels. You try to get the numbers. It's hard to get the hard numbers. And whenever you go someplace like Rockport that had not only their homes destroyed, their apartments destroyed, but all of the hotels and a lot of new hotels, you have businesses that are opening, but there's no one to come and work because they don't have a place to live. And then you have workers coming in trying to clean up and help. There's no place for them to stay. So the few rooms that are open are mostly those that are being held by people coming in to help. And so people have moved further and further away, and sometimes they won't come back. I mean, the school has lost about a third of their students and some of their teachers in Rockport, and so you don't know if they ever come back. Once you're gone, the rest of a school year, will you ever come back? Because you don't know if you have a place to live.
And they're losing their tax base,
Right.
which we haven't seen the impact totally yet. And speaking of that, we've got to have some uniformity from Austin on how you're going to deal with damaged property. Fort Bend, Montgomery County has reappraised their property. Houston, Harris County, HISD has not. So you got folks not even able to live in a home paying the appraised value from last year. No adjustments. It's crazy. And it's unfair and unjust. It's got to be dealt with.
So how do you deal with that when people say, oh, you're over this whole rebuilding process, but you're like, yeah, but not housing. And if that's the major issue, then how do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, I don't do housing. I don't have the authority to do anything with regard to housing.
Well, I'm sure they all come and ask you.
Yeah. Well, no, they don't, because it's not in our jurisdiction. But what our job is everything from cleaning up debris to making sure when it comes to courthouses, fixing public structures, things like that, lobbying Washington with Governor Abbott, trying to get as much money as we can for Texas, and then devising plans to spend that money, giving options to mayors and county judges to say, okay, this reservoir ought to be built, this reservoir ought to be built, but they're the ones that make the choice. In other words, if they want to use money for a buyout, and those buyouts have to be voluntary. If you've got one person sitting in a 100-acre, 200-acre subdivision that decides, no, I'm going to stay, that person stays. But at the end of the day, all of those structures, whether you're building dams, whether you're building levees, whether you're spending your money to raise houses, things like that, are all made by Texas law by county judges or mayors, depending on what the jurisdiction is. And so we have a team of experts led by Sam Brody from Texas A&M Galveston, who's probably the best flood expert in the state. And they're meeting with all these folks constantly. Here's the options. What do you want to do? And then when they give us their options and the money has been appropriated, which it has, then they're going to decide which one of those mitigation measures they're going to take.
Percentage of what has been rebuilt, where are we? 10, 20%? And
On
then
housing,
what's your timeline? Is it 10 years where you want to be completed in terms of the public infrastructure you were talking about? Because you say you're not over housing. And so where are we in terms of a percentage of what has been rebuilt?
We were told by the housing industry in finance 2 months ago, it's going to take 2 years longer than it should. You want to know why? Lack of skilled labor. You want to know why? Because the undocumented workers are not allowed to freely come and help us recover. So there's a lot of other issues that are compounding.
I would say 2 years longer, but
2 years longer.
But what is that period? Is it?
You can't find
5
workers
years
in
plus
Houston
2?
right now. 2 years longer than it should, and they're working. Now I don't know how to measure the success.
Got it.
We still got, and people are trying to decide what to do. You take Maryland's been flooded 3 times in the last 3 years. The city's debating what kind of proposals and restrictions make everyone, if they rebuild, they got to go at least a couple of feet higher. But I personally sit here and frustrated, and will publicly say we're not ready for the next storm. I think absolutely John and the emergency crews, the debris, the lobbying in Washington has been successful at this stage. But in terms of preparing the next hurricane season, we're not a hell of a lot better down the road than we were coming out of the last one. And we need to be talking. See, the problem is nobody will talk like this. Houston celebrated they got a couple of more rescue boats the other day. We're not ready for a 50-inch rain come next fall.
Agree?
Well, I agree. And some of the other issues we have are insurance appraisals. People had appraisals on their property, and then they started getting bids on what it was going to really cost, and it was so much more, so they asked for reappraisals. We were in a bad situation because right after our hurricane, then everybody was going to Florida. So, the person that came to appraise my house, literally you could tell he was ready to run out the door because they were paying more over there. The other thing happened to some of our construction people too. You had a lot of local people that did rebuilding and roofing, and there were those that came from other states and came in and sucked up their workers, and they haven't come back. And what John's saying too, and the building industry will tell you, we don't have enough labor right now.
Yeah, crazy.
We just don't. And they did not think that they had the shortage that they have after they came in, sucked it out, and then saw something like this. We do not have the labor force that we need to rebuild.
Disasters bring out the best in people, but they also bring out the worst in people. And the number one area of fraud in every disaster is always debris haulers. And I saw a bunch of that. The debris haulers would say, if you don't pay me X dollars more, I'm going to move to Florida, despite the fact they had a contract to do these kinds of things, and trying to hold county judges and mayors hostage to get more money and stuff like that. But the worst part about some of these guys is they would say, they simply wouldn't, when TxDOT would come in, they'd say, well, we're leaving if TxDOT's coming in. And I go, why are you leaving? They said, well, we don't want TxDOT to do it. And the reason is, they don't care if it took, some of these guys, most were good. Some of these guys didn't care if it took a year to get that debris off the street, because every pile was their money, a pile of money. They got paid by the amount that they picked up. The last thing they wanted was the state to come in there and do it. And so one of the things that has to be done, I think, in the next session of the legislature is writing legislation to be able to override these folks and to hold them to their contracts and say, you can't just say you're moving somewhere else, or you can't say, I'm not allowing another debris hauler to come in. Basically, the way we got around that is we just brought them in. And
TxDOT, you're talking about.
We brought TxDOT in, and we brought other debris haulers in. We had plenty of debris haulers that were, but county judges and mayors that were intimidated. We just simply said, don't let the door hit your butt on the way out of Texas. We got 300 guys that'll be in your city tomorrow, and they were. And so some of them left, and we hope they never come back.
So if there is so much to do when it comes to the legislature, who's leading on that?
Well, I think you have, when the mayors and the judges and all of the team that's working right now will have a plan to present to the legislature. I think the plan is August sometime, maybe toward the end of August. We'll have, okay, this is what we think you, as members of the legislature, ought to write into the law to make us more prepared next time for this disaster or a tornado in Wichita Falls or anything else. That's the first thing. The second part will go a bit faster than that because the federal money, or at least a good chunk of it, has already been appropriated, and that will start the process of deciding whether or not you're going to build this reservoir, whether you're going to build this levee, or what are you going to do to try to mitigate, or are you going to, clean out this creek or whatever in order to facilitate the flow of the water. But you're never going to be prepared for 63 inches of water. I mean, I don't care what you do, you're not going to be prepared for 63 inches of water. And the other thing that's happening too is the floodplains are constantly changing. Every time you build north of Houston or any city, and you lay down more asphalt and you lay down more concrete, that water doesn't get to soak in the aquifer below, and it runs out, and the more that you have, the more that it spreads. And so you see in Mireland and a bunch of those places that were never in the floodplain before, all of a sudden got 2 feet of water in them. And it's because growth happens.
The good news is, if you like a lot of discussion, every committee has been to Houston, county affairs, finance, business and commerce, everybody's studying it, but there are specific action that doesn't need to be studied. All you got to do is listen to people in Kingwood. They flooded for the first time, and they want you to dredge Center River because it's so full of silt that it's lost its capacity. So it's time for government to quit talking and go to work. The reservoir on the west side, the only way you're going to prevent people being told at 2 in the morning for the first time in their lives that wave of water is not rainwater, it's water released by the Corps of Engineers. The only solution that is a third reservoir. So I don't know what the hell is a holdup. So,
I think they settled on that.
the money's in a pipeline, but as I said a while ago, if we get another storm, which we will.
But a lot of that flooding was people opening reservoirs up.
That's what I'm saying.
And not telling anybody downstream until
Which gets back to
they opened
leadership.
it up.
Somebody's got to be in charge. You can't wait for the city or the county judge to get their act together. Who's going to let people know? They knew apparently 24 hours before the flooding that they were going to release the water, or certainly it was a likely. Well, I would much rather be told during the daytime with get my family and my valuable possessions out of there than 2 in the morning. I mean, it's just, we've got to learn from it, and it's got to be preparation, proactive, and somebody's got to be in charge. I'm not sure the model of depending, John, on the county. I understand local control. It's been around since I've been around, which is a long time. I don't think you can wait. I mean, for instance, I was in the disaster briefing that Governor Abbott had on a Friday before the storm came through Houston on Sunday. If you would listen to the National Weather Service, they had 2 people representing them, and everyone talked. The National Guard was there, DPS was there, all the entities. The one that made the impression on me was the weather people said, if this model right here, where it goes offshore and comes back, we've never seen anything like it. Governor Abbott came out and started mentioning that people should consider evacuating. Emmett and Sylvester both said, no. We don't want to clutter the freeways. Somebody ultimately, and I understand local control and they're on the ground, but I just think if we're going to experience anything similar to this storm, we got to have preparation, you got to have a playbook, and somebody's got to be in charge.
So you're saying that if in case of a natural disaster, as opposed to relying on mayors, what you're saying is
because of our diversity, Roland. I mean,
should the governor have that authority to say, look, listen to the experts.
I think you should.
Your point. If it's release the water, I'm making the order, and is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we cannot have a rural state that we've all grown up in. We have an urban state now. And the models of depending on the smaller communities making decisions for themselves, when it gets to something like Houston, Harris County, somebody's got to be in charge. And not to mention Beaumont, Port Arthur. I mean, you just go around.
That?
Then you got poor Rockport that's at everyone's mercy.
Well, the issues, like for Rockport and Refugio, they couldn't even communicate with anyone. They had no communication at all. I mean,
Making my point.
we could not communicate for
So
a long time.
you had no
They had no
regional emergency management system.
Well, they had emergency management room, and they were there, and they were dealing with it, but they couldn't communicate to the outside world because all communication was shut down. I mean, their towers were gone, you know, their facilities.
Wow.
They could not communicate with anyone. They really couldn't. They
Now,
had no communication.
let me not make it sound as easy as perhaps me just being in charge. You don't want to unnecessarily scare folks. You know, the county judge, and we had a horrible experience when people evacuated whichever one of the storms it was. You know, 24 hours on Houston freeways.
Yeah, that was after.
I mean, it was horrible.
Rita after Katrina.
Okay, which one? So you don't want to have false alarms, but someone's got to take the responsibility because we were not ready for the Harvey experience.
I agree with that. No question, it'd be more efficient if during a disaster there was a dictator or whatever you want to call it saying, boom, 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 we're going to make these decisions. But you have to change state law to do it. It's not just mayors and county judges.
Hold on. Again, for the no, we say you have to change state law. So what you're saying is that
state law requires mayors and county judges to call the shots in disaster.
In a natural disaster.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the governor or any state official, they don't have that power.
They have the power to perform what those folks agreed to. That's right.
So if a county judge or a mayor says no,
You're right.
the governor's going.
For
No
instance,
evacuation.
They actually that Friday afternoon got in a little dispute. I mean, I sat there and watched it.
for instance, one of the problems that we had was there were some counties that Task Force 1 and Task Force 2 cities were not allowed to go into because they said, we're going to take care of this ourselves.
Couldn't go in?
Could not go in because the mayor says
Local
we're not
control.
going there. Something is like mosquito spraying, for instance.
Yeah.
We had Governor Abbott commandeered 4 C-130s, hooked them up, took the bombs off or whatever.
Appreciate that.
Put mosquito equipment on it.
That's the ultimate mosquito killer right there.
Because you had this huge mosquito problem the first, second, and third week after the hurricane. But they were not allowed to spray in Houston because they said, we don't want that. And so those C-130s had to go around the city limits of Houston and spray other places in order to get
That's
rid of it.
crazy.
Wow.
And that's just one example. TxDOT wasn't allowed to come inside the city of Houston either.
TxDOT could not go into a city. There were cities that said,
Go figure that.
we don't want TxDOT.
Because they had their
One
contractors in
One
place.
particular city in southeast Texas said, we don't want TxDOT to come in because, I know why, because they were getting pressure from the debris hauler and said, I don't want anybody else to come in. Well, it was the last pile of crap left in the state was that particular city. Here comes another 12-inch rain. All of a sudden, the debris blocked the flow of water down the drainage ditch in front of the houses, flooded again. Yeah. I said, hey, Mayor, how you doing? You still want TxDOT to stay out? I said, no, why don't y'all be coming in next week? So they came in and cleaned the stuff up. But it's just stuff like that just drives you crazy when you know what's going on and somebody has got some kind of goofy special relationship with somebody that doesn't want any competition to pick up debris. But that's the law.
Wow. Questions? Don't be scared. Yes, go right ahead. Microphone right here.
I would like to introduce my daughter, Victoria, who's beautiful and is sitting right here.
Victoria.
Always a family shout out. Always.
Hi, I'm Betsy Furler.
Victoria, right?
I live in Meyerland. For those of you who
What's your name?
Betsy Furler. I said that, but y'all were chatting.
Go ahead.
For those of you who don't know, Meyerland is a very affluent community. Houses between probably 500,000 and 1.5 prior to.
In DC, that's called low income.
Yeah. And our community really came together in all our floods to do all of the initial recovery, especially. And we're here at South by Southwest, and it's now 2018. So I'm wondering about tech solutions and kind of what people are thinking about as far as trying to get tech solutions. For example, in Rockport, where all the communication was cut off, satellite phones, other types of tech solutions that might be out there, both for communication but also to coordinate efforts.
Go ahead.
Well, I can tell you about one communication deal. There's a data center going to be built in Texas probably over the next year or so. And one of the things that we're asking to be included and is going to be included in that RFP is a provision that says that data center will put mini towers next to the AT&T, not AT&T, but next to the power generation sections in each one of those counties, the rural counties, because Houston doesn't quite have that problem, but in the rural counties. And we're hoping that goes through with that process, that data center. It's a 45 megawatt data center where it gets beat, and that they'll have that communication as part of that RFP set up in each one of those rural counties. There'll be one next to the power generation in Rockport. There'll be one next to the power generation station in Port Aransas, wherever there is power generation, because those are the first ones to come back. And we would start those, and you wouldn't have then to wait on AT&T to put its tower back up. You wouldn't have to require those kind of things. So that's one thing that is already in the works that we're doing.
Well, and there were temporary towers put up, but it took a while to get them up, and you still had to go up on the bridge, Copano Bridge, to actually get high enough to use them for a while. It's just an issue because of where the location is, and so much was out, but that was an issue. But I will say that the electric companies did a phenomenal job of getting electricity back.
So let's assume there's another natural disaster, flood or whatever. How will your folks communicate? Have they come up with to your point with technology, they come up with a system that says, look, if lines go down, we got to be able to talk to Austin or a neighboring county?
Right, and they're working. They have their emergency management place, and it's still okay. They lost, their county seat basically is gone. I mean, their building's gone, their council chambers is gone. So there's a lot of rebuilding, and they're requesting things now to fix that. But like John said, this is the part of rebuilding, especially in the rural areas, of things that just went down that you don't expect because you've not dealt with it in so long. And so these are the things that are requests that are going to rebuild Texas and to FEMA, because a lot of the money that we're asking for comes from FEMA also for all these different things that all these communities are asking for.
Question.
I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something else that's awful goofy, and that is, when we talk about the rescue part of it, those folks know they got all their contracts in place for any private sector help they need, the whole bit, the state government, the whole bit. They're ready to go when that disaster, when that hurricane moves through. They're already there. They're moving in. Why in the world can't the General Land Office, FEMA, and HUD work out all of these contracts before the next disaster hits, instead of spending 3, 4, and 5 months writing a contract, delineating what each one's responsibility is about? And I'm not sure if that's federal government or state government, but when you take 3 or 4 months to figure out who's responsible for what, when people are sitting in a hotel room or they're trying to figure out how to get their houses back, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense.
And you also need to pre-position shelters. It's crazy as hell. On Sunday morning, Houston and Harris County has to scramble to set up the Georgia Brown or to go out to the NRG Stadium. Those ought to be already positioned. We're going to live with future hurricanes, but we keep continuing to be caught off guard by them, and we can do a lot better.
Question.
Yeah, so first off, thank you for the time. I appreciate your comments. My question is, so I'm Joe Sullivan, CEO of a drone data management software company. And so the topic is future-proofing disaster recovery. I'm wondering what processes you have in place to leverage new technology developments in geospatial data and communication. As an example, we were actually looped in for disaster recovery efforts with Hurricane Matthew and then again Hurricane Irma, and from what we heard, the field responders cut their time in half.
So to translate your question, you mean how will they use drones in the future?
Yeah, well, drones,
So
my
we-
software,
We
whatever.
track geospatial data. They pound like, what the hell did he just say? So you're saying
Maps, yeah. So how are you using mapping technology
Thank you.
and aerial imaging to get faster at what you're doing?
Anybody?
Yeah, Task Force 1, Task Force 2 have drones available to them and use them quite frequently. It saves lots of folks and lots of time and gives them, I mean, obviously information they didn't have before they put those, but those have been in effect for some time, but used in primarily the rescue operation portion of it. And it's one of the reasons that the rescue operation works so well. Frankly, I think, and I hate to say this because it sounds like I'm, grabbing for stuff, but the truth of the matter is that they ought to be together. The rescue operation and the response operation ought to be in one shop, one place, where everybody's trained, everybody's ready to go. Either move it to College Station or move College Station to wherever the hell these folks are, but they need to be, I mean, if you're going to have a new county judge and a new mayor that's never gone through a 63-inch rainfall, he better know something the day that thing hits. And right now, through no fault of their own, they simply don't have it, don't know where to get the technology, wouldn't know where to call for a drone, wouldn't know how to fill out paperwork and stuff like that occurs a lot. I know because I had to learn all that stuff when I was appointed, and it really slows down the process of being able to help folks.
I don't think 254 counties, I don't think we can afford to have 254 different plans during a disaster. And I think what the legislature needs to address, certainly some size and scope, best practices for how you're going to go into a storm. How you're going to prepare for it, how you're going to call it, the evacuation necessity, how you're going to recover, and govern from top down.
Question?
Roland, you asked the question earlier, and it's a tough question. I don't think it got the answer that I was hoping to hear. It is regarding the National Flood Insurance Program specifically. I'm going to read a brief statement from the Wall Street Journal, September 15th. Brian Harmon had just finished spending over $300,000 to fix his home in Kingwood, Texas, when Hurricane Harvey sent floodwaters completely over the roof. 6-bedroom house, which has an indoor swimming pool, sits along the San Jacinto River, has flooded 22 times since 1979, making it one of the most flood-damaged properties in the country. A lot of disaster recovery is focusing on what happens beforehand, not just the reactionary afterwards.
Right.
How can we expect to make progress when we continue to devote resources to, frankly, buildings that shouldn't be there, people that shouldn't be there? I'm reminded of people on Bolivar Peninsula during Ike, warned by the Weather Service to leave or face imminent debt, and yet you still have people stay. How, as an elected official, do you go about convincing people that it is in your best interest to leave? You have, Ms. Morrison, you said, they're waiting on their FEMA checks, and if they're going to come through, I mean, a lot of them do keep coming through and coming through and coming through, and it just seems to be a drain. That's
what I mean by the hard choices, because if it keeps flooding, hello, it's going to happen again.
There are a lot of hard choices, and as far as the FEMA checks coming in, one of the issues, and I know housing is a huge issue, and that's not Chancellor Sharp's, but the governor tried to do something locally that had never been done before and have, local people in charge. The problem is the federal government has the money, and it's all by their rules. And so a lot of the issues with the housing is FEMA has their rules, they have the money, they're the ones that distribute it. They won't let our state government decide how that's going to happen, and it's been a very difficult process.
So what I asked earlier, his point. So let's say we know of those areas that have consistently flooded. So there is no local or state law that says no more building in this area or you can't live here. What is it? Just you can live wherever the hell you want to live?
Well, you've got the buyouts, like.
Well, the city's going to require
a
a raising of any bill back. They're contemplating it. That's another problem. They're still studying it. But the city of Houston is going to propose, if you go back into Maryland and traditionally flooded areas, you're going to have to raise it a couple of feet. but that's only good if you don't have a storm. It goes over a couple of feet. And not only that, I don't think the tough political decisions of not allowing people to build back, before we get there, we got to stop new growth. I don't care where you drive in Houston right now, they're covering up any possible green space in areas for drainage. So, you know, as long as you got the chamber, as long as we continue to talk about welcome people from all over the country, it's a hell of a dilemma, but
So
I don't know where you'd even build a new reservoir. I assume the engineers and someone can find it. But if you go out to West Houston off Highway 6 and you want to do a third reservoir, I don't know how in the hell they're going to do it with all the development that's been going on right as we sit here and talk.
So to his point about when it comes to mapping drones, his point here, so you don't have an entity who is looking at this mass area to say, okay, let's not just look at houses or businesses. To your point,
Green
where
space.
does water go? So
Right.
no one's doing that?
Oh, no, we do.
That's
A&M
you're doing.
has.
They
bet.
study.
Okay,
No,
but-
they studied. They studied. They had studies from the 90s talking about what the reservoirs were going to do if they flood. It's the political will of saying we're not going to allow you to build.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you're studying it, what is your timeline to are you going to recommend to the legislature before
Yeah.
the next one? What's going to happen?
Yeah, but you understand Houston has no zoning.
No, and the county doesn't have ordinance making power. Zero in Harris County. Harris County.
Why isn't this panel called "What the Hell"?
Well, I
We
thought
live in
about that
Texas.
driving over here. I don't know why I'm on it. Harris County, the unincorporated part of Harris County would be the 11th largest city in the U.S. if it was a standalone city. It has zero general ordinance making power. You build where in the hell you want to, however you want to.
There are 3 cities in the state of Texas that don't have zoning. Houston, Victoria, and Wichita Falls.
Right,
Absolutely no zoning.
no
Sorry.
zoning. We don't have zoning either in Victoria.
We don't have, Harris County doesn't have ordinance making power. Go out there and build whatever you want to, wherever you want to, on the river banks, whatever.
What the hell?
But it's called less government.
That's the joy of Texas.
What's your question?
Hey, I'm Nancy Giordano. I'm first a shout out. I'm the mother of a senior aerospace engineer in College Station right now. So very, very proud of him. Professionally, I'm a strategic futurist. I get paid to help organizations and teams and industries understand how to future-proof, right? How to build. So as a citizen, I wonder if there is a mismatch right now between disaster recovery or disaster response and recovery, disaster philanthropy. Right, you talk a lot about wanting to get funds from the state or from federal funds, but there's this outpouring of philanthropy that happens, right, in the first days and the first weeks, and it's really mismatched with need. And at least from my perspective, I see giant mismatch, a giant inefficiency, and I am literally like corporate strategy gal, but suddenly I want to build a disaster philanthropy platform that makes it easier to match people's desire to give money, time, stuff, and support. And I'm just wondering if that's crazy or if it already exists.
Right. All of the, I think for the first time, all of the philanthropic organizations, the major ones in the state of Texas and the rebuild folks meet on a regular basis and sort of divvy up things that, somebody has a real problem that our county agent type folks have heard about in Rockport, Texas. Can any of you folks help with this particular problem and things like that? And
But
so
is it an efficient platform? 'Cause I
Well,
guess
actually, let me.
So it goes back
Look,
to tech.
I've covered numerous hurricanes and lived through Alicia and all this sort of stuff along those lines. So here's sort of what you also have. For the longest, the system in America was Red Cross.
right.
But what has happened is, when you now know, billions went to the Red Cross and they built 6 houses in Haiti.
Right.
And there are story after story. There are so many people now
Lack
who are
of
saying,
trust.
hell with the Red Cross. So the reality is, what has to happen, if you're talking about how do you construct that, you're going to have another massive entity that is able.
See, I would disagree with that.
No,
and say-
follow me here, because because scale is scale. Whether we want to deal with that or not, when you have small organizations that are going into places, what then happens is there are places they can't go into
Got
that a larger entity that is well known can. So, for instance, the Southern Baptist Convention, they have a disaster team. When a disaster happens, they send their trucks in. They are cooking food, and here's the governmental entities know them, know the previous work, and so they're allowed in. So then, when you have small entities who folks don't know, you don't know who's real, whose isn't.
I get that.
who's taking folks, who's scamming folks. And so the reason scale matters is because that's also legitimacy. And so I think, so what has to happen is, even if it's an umbrella organization that sort of is serving
Well, again,
different
I work in the
smaller
world of
groups,
future tech, right? I'm a futurist. I spend a lot of time in the world of AI and alternative to blockchains and all that stuff. So I can also tell you technology will be a way in being able to verify and match and do a whole bunch of stuff more efficiently than we are currently doing. But the trajectories that I'm paying attention to is income polarization, more and more people with really high incomes, and more people living in really vulnerable communities. Right? So when that happens, the rich feel that much more desire, want, and I want to be able to channel that way more effectively. How it then gets distributed, I agree with you. There might be ways to be able to manage that. But because trust is down in the Red Cross, everyone's doing a DIY, running their own fundraisers, creating their own pillows and blankets, buying bottled water instead of using purification systems. Do you guys realize in Hurricane Sandy, people sent 67,000 teddy bears to that town?
And
not Hurricane Sandy, I'm sorry, the Sandy Hook shooting. The Sandy shooting.
But follow me here. Here's why I also believe sometimes old helps the future. Let me just use a civil rights group. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a group made at Shaw University in 1960. Okay, major effort during the 60s when it came to civil rights. They were an umbrella organization. You still had your local group, but you could have been part of SNCC. Once you're under the SNCC umbrella, you can say we're part of SNCC. And so, as a part of this, again, because what happens is these disasters, people go, I want to give. I don't want to get to the Red Cross. Where do I give? I don't know who to give. What are y'all doing? What's your size? How many people? And so folks are just sort of all over the place. You see GoFundMes. But if you sort of have this umbrella entity that has scale, that exists outside of the Red Cross, that becomes the alternative, and people know, oh, I know it. I can trust it. I can send my money there, and it's going to happen, and they have transparency, then I'm able to believe that. But what I'm saying is, as long as that's not there, and it's just a free-for-all.
Well, I'm trying to build a step before that, which is something that allows people to at least have a place to go.
Go ahead, the next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, but it's I guess to tell you, it's no longer a free-for-all because it is coordinated. One of the advantages to having 130 of Dr. Stover's employees out in the field talking to people is time after time they tell us about the scam artists. They say, watch this person, and we're able to call into a judge and say, they're trying to, scam some money. I think they're former debris haulers that went into the philanthropy business or something. but it has helped a whole lot. Plus, we have a website now that has every one of those dollars that's reported to us that's on the website, and so anybody in Texas can see what that website is. No.
What's the website?
I don't know.
Really?
I'll find out.
Damn it, where's your staff? All right. Question.
Rebuildtexas.org, but it has a hashtag with it, so I'm not sure.
My name is Ashish Patel. I'm an industrial engineer. I work in the Texas Medical Center. I study doctors and hospitals that use Medicare funding. The question is, does the state have a cold medicine supply distribution network, or can you describe the program that at the time of emergency, how do we distribute medicines?
Anybody? What the hell?
No, one of the biggest issues that hospitals had during the recovery was not having electricity, not having water, especially if they were water cooled and they had to evacuate. So they were sending people other places in our area because they didn't have the utilities and the cool to where they keep the patients or the medical.
So you have no state. So let's say they're common. I mean, let's just say insulin.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't have any sort of state agency or with a repository of insulin that can.
I don't know what you do.
No, those people during the rescue operation were moved.
SOL, I got you.
North.
That's a new name of this panel. What the hell? And shit out of luck. That's.
No, during the rescue operation, when there was a medical need and things like that, those people were immediately evacuated to the nearest functioning hospital, which was generally north of where they were.
Okay.
And they did. They went to Austin. They went to San Antonio. They went north. That's where our medical went.
So Jennifer Welch, class of '91 from Texas A&M. Quick question on the role of corporations and organizations. Actually, I'm looking for guidance from government entities, either agencies or elected officials, to help corporations and other organizations understand how they can better respond. So an example of this consistency from time to time is officials turn over small counties. During the Riley Road wildfires and during 2011 when Texas was pretty much on fire everywhere, my county in particular had no crisis responder. There was no crisis communications person. Given the role I had had in my corporation, Marvin Odom graciously allowed me to go and do that role for my county. So I acted as the crisis responder for a small county. What I learned from that during this crisis is I called on Rockport. And I said, and I'm speaking to a junior assistant at the Chamber of Commerce at this time, and I said, look, can we come in as a group of communicators and help you with your crisis response, either for your elected officials or for your first responders, or what can we do? But because they didn't know who we were from Adam, then that was a reluctance, like, I'm not going to turn over the keys to my Facebook page for you, even though we knew what to do. So there's a way to use skills out in corporate America, but we would probably need a way through government agencies to organize those so that when there's a disaster in Rockport, you can bring on the folks in Dallas who have the skills to help them get back up on their communications, and vice versa. And we were talking about doing this nationwide, but I think that some encouragement from the government, either academics or state agencies, et cetera, might be helpful for that. Could you speak to how you could see corporate America helping you with that?
Sure. You know, another one of the issues, because, I mean, there was an outpouring of help and people wanting to help. The issue was kind of like what John talked about before. We had these small communities of elected officials that were inundated and were trying to just get past the daily what was going on. What has actually happened, and someone said they feel like, you know, I don't know, maybe it's government at its best, at its worst. People finally just get beyond saying, well, I'm never going to get any help from FEMA. I'm never going to get any, this is never going to happen. And so they start working out on their own. All of the communities have long-term recovery groups that have formed because there's still so much that needs to be done. And they've put together the organizations like you're talking about with United Way, with United Methodist groups, and all these working together to help go in, and Habitat for Humanity, and you know, to do the building. There's still, you know, places that just need to get the muck out still, and so this has happened. But as far as a large organization, there's not one that I know of. It's been more on the local level, but there was such an outpouring of help. I mean, one of the issues in Rockport was we had all these people wanting to send things from all over. There was no place to store anything. Right. I mean, I was going crazy trying to find storage because we had these 18-wheelers say, we've got all this stuff, we want to bring it. No, we don't have a place to put it.
Which is why, if I could put his question with your question with your question, and that is, if you don't have, because pretty much what you're saying is, somebody said, we'll know who you are, which means you need to establish legitimacy, which means that you would have had to do something beforehand. Somebody go, okay, they're credible. You're talking about mapping. And so if you have that entity, and then you know where the need is, so all of a sudden versus, oh yeah, we've got 5 18-wheelers with water, your deal is, yo, we got enough water. But in LaPorte, they need some water. But what has to happen is, this is where I think, independent of government, where the entity gets created. And so there's going to be another natural disaster. It's going to happen. And so then, when it happens, switch is flipped. Then whoever that entity is, nonprofit or whatever, they come in and say, this is what we have. We're assessing need. We know where stuff is going. To the general public, if you want to give here, that we know where it's going. So what I'm saying is, create it. Create it, the help, because again, I'm telling you right now, from a public relations standpoint, from a trust standpoint, the Red Cross is I won't say they're almost at rock bottom, but literally, people are saying, I will never give to the Red Cross. And every time another story comes out, I mean, the United Way is still dealing with the high salaries crisis from 25 years ago. People still say, I'm not trusting the United Way because how much they're spending. And so, and again, it's just a matter of one of those things, if you build it, people will come.
Well,
real quick, then last question.
And that's why the response part has to be a full-time deal like the rescue part is, so that it is all set up before it ever happens, and you know exactly what you're doing in the umbrellas there.
Yeah, and there was one group I wanted to say, but they did one thing. HEB was phenomenal because what they do is come in, they have the kitchens, they have the food, they have the cooks, they have the trailers. They just roll it in and they get it done, and that's the way it needs to be set up.
That's what the SBC does. Yeah.
Right.
Last question.
Okay, so this question is from someone who was on the San Jac River, literally on, there when it was flooding, house got flooded, was having to be transported. And I have a question from these citizens of Rockport right now. They are not able to be here, but they wanted to use me to ask a question. Currently, only 1/3 of the businesses has been opened back up, and many people are still living in displaced places. What is one major step that will continue the recovery of that? And this may be a great question for you, as an elected official.
Sure.
What's going to happen with that?
Well, and as far as I'm concerned, it's still the housing. That's still the issue. There's not enough transitional housing. And like John's saying, there needs to be a plan prior to a disaster. Because, right before Hurricane Harvey happened, FEMA sold a lot of their trailers. And no, do we want to have trailers for permanent? No. But they didn't even have anything to bring in. And so then when all of this started, all the applying and trying to get temporary housing, people were in hotels, and a lot still are, had to move real north, which hurts a community. But I still think the biggest issue we have is working with FEMA and getting housing resolved. They don't have it resolved. It's not a good plan, and it was given down to the state. The state had never done it before. It was a good idea, but as John said, we need to plan before the next disaster to fix it because the FEMA funding has just been a disaster.
And are y'all working on that right now? As are our elected officials working on that, right now as we speak, before the next hurricane season comes in?
Yes, it's federal. It's federal. It's federal money, and our hands are tied because it's all federal, and that's the problem.
And keep in mind, just again, when Sandy Hook happened, you had a number of folks who were voting against funding for Sandy Hook, and then when Harvey hit, the same people who voted against Sandy Hook were begging, like, can y'all vote for Harvey? And Hurricane Sandy. And then Hurricane Sandy, people said, oh, what the hell? Oh, now you want to support you, but you screwed us. Now we're going to screw you back. But that goes to your point about small government, big government, less government. People hate government except when they are in trouble. And then all of a sudden, every Republican and Democrat looks the same. I mean, that's just how it works. Final comment.
I think the challenge is to stay focused. If we're not careful, complacency will set in because we got all kind of other pressures. HISD's got its problems. State's fixing to take it over. U of H raised tuition 3.5%. I can go on and on. The things that I get calls on, the calls on the hurricane recovery are getting less and less. And so if we're not careful, we'll move on to the next session worried about a budget issue or public ed and other serious issues. And before you know it, we'll be sitting here and another storm comes along. We haven't made the changes.
Representative Morrison.
Well, I mean, for me, it's still an everyday issue just because of where I'm located, that dealing with people not having places to live and businesses that are trying to open, but they don't have people to work. It's just a horrible issue. We've got to fix it. And I'm looking to this gentleman who has been all around the state and looked at what's going on and is a rural person too that knows that there are things that we've got to fix. We've got to get ready for the next disaster, and our elected officials locally have to be ready because they haven't been in a disaster in a long time.
Chancellor Sharp.
Well, I can't speak to housing because it's not my bailiwick, but I can tell you common sense would tell you that just like we do in rescue and we want to do in the response, you ought to have your stuff together before the hurricane hits. And it is not just mayors and judges. It's a whole bunch of different government. I mean, you're going to have to go into river authorities and you're going to have to ask them the question at Lake Conroe, could you when you see a rain like this coming, can you lower your water 3 feet instead of flooding Kingwood and everybody else the day before? And is the reason you didn't lower it because you didn't want to inconvenience somebody that had a boat in the lake? I mean, when it comes time for disasters, everybody has to make some sacrifice. And And I think the judges and the mayors on the rebuild part, on the stuff that we've worked with them on, have done a remarkable job in most instances, including Aransas County.
Final comment here is very simple. I've covered enough stuff to know, and I've talked to cover county government and city government. America is very good at reacting after the fact. O-rings cause a shuttle to blow up. We go, oh, we might want to fix that, but we knew there was a problem before. So many other disasters. The bridge collapses in Minnesota, then we say, oh, we need to fix our bridges. This is an example of if we don't prepare before, we don't have a plan, it is going to happen again. And again, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, when you're stranded on a house and your family is facing impending death, you don't care who is showing the hell up with the boat. And so that has to be our philosophy. And so the pressure has to be put on Congress when it comes to FEMA and other federal agencies, but also on the governor of the state in terms of how do you get the state right. We thank all of you for attending this session. Thank you so very much. Give it up for our panel.